Hi everyone, it's Steph here. This is the Noveltea Corner and welcome to another Psy-Changeling recap video. Today I'm going to be talking about Heart of Obsidian, which is book 12 in the series and is Caleb Krychek's book. This is the first time I've reread this since 2018 and I had remembered the main things about this book that affected the greater world building and then forgotten everything else. So this was an utterly delightful rereading experience and a lot happens in this one. If you are unfamiliar with my Psy-Changeling recap series, I am currently rereading each of the books one by one and then filming a very in-depth recap of what happens in the books and my feelings. I include things that move the world along, I include things that just made me smile, and I also talk about the main couple because this is a paranormal romance series. I will leave a link to the playlist that has all the previous videos in here. I'm also one of the co-hosts for the Psy-Changeling Readathon here on YouTube. We are reading 3 books every month and then talking about them at the end of the month in a live show. We have had 3 live shows so far. We have 2 more scheduled with the potential to do possibly 2 more to continue into the Psy-Trinity series, so stay tuned. We may be making a decision around that soon, I don't know. Regardless, I will be rereading all of the books all of the way through, all the way hopefully to book 20, which is coming out in July, and I'm very excited. So we are talking about Heart of Obsidian, which as I said is Caleb Krychek's book. Caleb was one of the Psy on the Psy Council, and he is probably the most powerful Psy alive. He is a dual cardinal, which means he is off the scale on both his telekinetic and telepathic abilities, and as such, people fear him quite a bit because he has a lot of raw power. The whole way through this series, he has been searching for someone. At the end of Tangle of Need, which was the last book, he finally found her. And we don't know who the her is at the start of this book. And in fact, for the first couple of chapters, we don't get her name. I'm going to say her name because I know exactly who she is, and also because it's going to make it easier than me saying her. So the romantic relationship in this story is between Caleb Krychek and Sahara Kyriakis. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because she's Faith's cousin. We met Faith way back in book 2, and she has since been a part of the series. And she is a Foreseer. She is a member of the Night Star clan in the Psy race. And she knew that her cousin was missing and had been missing for many years. At the very beginning of this book, we open with Caleb in his home in Moscow with this woman cowering in a corner, and she won't eat anything, she is unkempt, and he has just rescued her from a containment facility where she's been kept for roughly 7 years. She's clearly very traumatized, and he's trying to coax her into eating food and to having a shower, and he's very straightforward about it. Caleb is a member of the Psy race, and if you're up to this video, you know very much that these characters are very aloof and removed and they don't show their emotions, so he's very sort of clinical with her and he's just telling her to eat the food. However, the food that he's giving her is not food that the Psy would typically eat. They tend to eat quite bland food, and he's giving her fruit and bread with honey and things that are sweet and that will either evoke memories or a physical reaction to the taste of the food, because he already knows that the woman in front of him, her silence has been absolutely shattered. That she's not silent and he can't treat her that way. He also, in recognizing her trauma, begins to realize that there are parts of this house that he's brought her to that are unsafe, such as a balcony that he immediately starts to go and build a fence around because he's quite concerned that she could either hurt herself or that she might even take her own life. So straight away we're starting to get this sense that Caleb, who is this very aloof character, this very dangerous man in the Psy, has thought things through a lot with regards to whoever this is, and that there is a significant amount of care that's gone into it, even if the way that he delivers it is very cold and removed from the situation. So we're starting to get this dual image of who Caleb is. Now, what I didn't say at the start of this book is that Caleb is not a good guy. Now I'm going to stop there because I just realized I forgot to do my content warnings for this book, and I really have to do the content warnings for this book because they're quite significant. This is probably the darkest of the Psy-Changeling books. Can't remember if any of them get darker than this, to be honest. And a lot of it has to do with Caleb's backstory, which we'll talk about later on. However, both Caleb and Sahara have very traumatic pasts. So there is kidnapping and captivity, there is torture, there is significant abuse, there is psychic rape that is mentioned in this story. You have a morally grey hero, you have a heroine who is dealing with PTSD, and her hero is holding her captive after rescuing her from captivity. And he has his reasons that are very justified in his mind, because this book falls under the trope of morality chain, which, if you're not familiar with that, is when the hero is a bad guy, or the heroine, it can be a heroine, but in this case it's a hero, is a bad guy or morally grey at the very least. And he has no issue with hurting others and get his way and to do what he wants. However, the one redeeming part of his life is his heroine, and he is devoted to her. And we begin to get that seeded through this story right from the very beginning. So that's where we are with that. And clearly I am very excited to talk about this book because I'm still holding it up, even though I never hold up the books because they're heavy, and this one's the hardback. So I'm going to put this down and put the picture on the screen and go back to talking. Wow, I'm all over the place in this video. Sorry guys. Okay, so Caleb is sort of fixing all of these hazards in this house, and then he hears Sahara breaking the mirrors, and she's really concerned about the smoke detectors because she thinks it's a camera. And so Caleb very quietly starts going around by replacing the harsh lights in the bedroom with a lamp and turning off those lights and removing the mirrors and removing the smoke detectors and things like that so that she feels safe and comfortable. What I will say, and I'll come back to this later on, is he does a lot of this with his abilities, and it's almost just like second nature. He barely even thinks about the amount of power he's using because he has that much of it. But I will talk about that a bit later on. Very early on, Caleb gets a psychic call from his assistant, Silver Mercant, who lets him know that a think tank has been attacked because they've been previously known to be anti-silence, and Pure Psy has taken credit for this attack or poisoning. And they have this discussion around the fact that both Caleb and Silver have been trying to get someone undercover into the Pure Psy ranks to find out. And it's very hard to separate the Pure Psy story from this because it is intrinsically linked to Caleb's story. So I'm not even going to separate this out. So we'll be talking about Pure Psy the whole way through. We find out that Sahara's mind is currently being shielded by Caleb. He's created these obsidian shields around her so that she won't be overwhelmed by being back in the net, and that also people can't find her. And we also find that underneath that layer of security, what really protected Sahara during her captivity was the fact that she created a labyrinth in her mind. And this labyrinth shifts and changes, and it makes it really hard for her to keep her train of thought. So basically she comes across as unstable. And throughout this first conversation with Caleb, she's desperately trying to stay coherent and to remember her train of thought because she wants to find out why she's with Caleb and why she's here and what's going on. And at the same time, Caleb is still continuing to think about Sahara's comfort. He does things like make sure that the temperature of the house is an appropriate temperature for her. It doesn't matter so much to him because it's not something that he really minds, but her comfort is a big thing for him. And again, he continues with the food. He keeps teleporting in all of this really lovely, sweet food that he thinks that she'll like. It's not food that he would eat. And then there's a really great scene where he teleports in some pastries for breakfast, and she takes one and puts it on the table, and then she takes a second one on a second plate and sets a place for him and invites him to breakfast. And he actually eats the food because he's realizing that she's trying to sort through what's going on with her. And so they sit down and they have breakfast together. And yet there's still this very deep sense of unease. He knows exactly who she is and who she is to him, but she doesn't know really who he is. And so that's a big part of the first quarter of the book, is just her coming to realize who she is and how she knows Caleb. She tells him that there is a key to unlocking the labyrinth in her mind and that she's buried it within her mind. What we find out a little bit later on is that the labyrinth is keyed to her emotional well-being. And so when she feels unsafe, this labyrinth really sort of becomes this fortress that protects her mind. And then it begins to unlock itself when she feels safe. And she eventually does begin to feel safe within Caleb's home. And so it begins to unlock itself. However, before that happens, there is an attack in Perth and an anchor for the sign net is killed. And we learnt in the previous book that when an anchor is killed, it basically destroys a section of the net, and anyone connected to that part of it can die because they've suddenly lost their connection to the sign net. And so this happens in Perth, and Caleb teleports out immediately during this breakfast and tries to telepathically hold together the part of the net that is still there, but they still lose a lot of lives. And Caleb and the arrows are there to help sort of pick up the pieces. And he tasks Vasek and Aiden with trying to figure out who is responsible for killing the anchor in Perth. And by the time Caleb comes back, Sahara's labyrinth has disappeared, but she tells him that it's gone, but she's not convinced that her memories will come back. She still doesn't know who he is, but she's remembered her name, and she remembers that she was a member of Night Star and who her parents were. And she asks him why he's brought her to Moscow and is keeping her with him. And his reply to that is simply that she belongs to him. And of course, this then makes her very curious and determined to work out what their relationship is. There's also a lot of talk initially in the first couple of chapters around Sahara's appearance because she's been kept in captivity for a long time, so she looks very unkempt. And there's this internal discussion of when she finally is brave enough to look in a mirror and trust that it's not a two-way mirror. She sees her appearance and it's sort of a shocking thing for her because she doesn't recognize the woman in the mirror. And so her process of finally sort of taming her hair and getting all of that under control is symbolic of her beginning to feel more in control of what's going on. And I liked that aspect of it. It's not the first time it's happened in the Psy-Changeling series. I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but it does take place earlier on in the series as well. After she's done that, she visits Caleb in his office and he's in a meeting, but he lets her wander around the office and he has a bookshelf in there. And there's a whole lot of technical books, but there's also these knickknacks and these books that she wouldn't have expected to find on his shelf, books of poetry and plays, and all of these little items and memorabilia that have really no place being in Caleb's office, and yet they're there. And every time she touches them or she sort of sees them, it makes her wonder. And this is a little bit of an Easter egg that comes back later on, because all of these items are in some way connected to her, but she doesn't know that yet. Then Caleb is contacted by the Net Mind and the Dark Mind. So they're the neo-sentient minds of the net who he talks to directly, and they're really concerned and they show him a part of the net that has completely died. It's been killed by this mental virus. And we know that Caleb has been tracking this for a little while. He ends up going to see Nikita Duncan, who is a very powerful Psy who is known to deal in sort of mental viruses. And so he's really trying to work out whether she's involved. He doesn't really believe that, but he has to check. And they discuss how this virus is very reminiscent of what happened at Sunshine Station, which we found out about in Cartier's book when she and Dev went out to explore this dead town and realized that that all the Psy in the town had gone crazy because they'd been infected by this virus. So that's another underlying subplot mystery that's been going on. When he returns, Sahara's taken out this maths textbook from the office and is flicking through it, and inside it she sees all of these handwritten notes, and they're written in 2 different coloured pens and by 2 different hands. And the book deeply unsettles her. She doesn't know why, and Caleb eventually tells her that she's always hated maths, but she loved languages and she could speak many different languages, which she had forgotten. And they have this discussion around skin privileges because she is craving touch because she's very vulnerable at this point. He gives that to her. I'm pretty sure at this point he's sort of either holding her or leaning into her while they're sitting down. At this point, Caleb reveals that in his past he had breached silence to share skin privileges with someone. He doesn't say who it was, but that it had happened. And having observed the changelings, he is aware of the importance of that skin-to-skin contact. Sort of 8 days into being kept at Caleb's house, Sahara begins to remember some things from her life before she was captured at 16. And this includes the fact that Caleb was the protege of Enrique Santos, who was the villain in the very first book. And he was trained from a very young age, I think from 7 years old, by Enrique. And she begins to remember Enrique's reputation as being a not particularly great guy. And then she also realizes that Caleb is not going to be releasing her. And so she begins to feel very caged in, and he eventually teleports her to this very open expanse of beach and allows her just to walk for as long as she wants to. He leaves her in peace until she asks for his company. It's at this point that we begin to get hints at what Sahara's Psy powers might actually be. She has some limited backsight, which is related to the F-Psy, but that's not her main capability. And what's hinted at is that her main ability is what was the cause for her capture in the first place, because it's something that is very useful to people in power. Then there's another attack by Pure Psy, this time in Copenhagen, and he takes Sahara back to Moscow, and then he teleports himself there, and he is part of the rescue efforts, and his rescue efforts are captured by the media and shown around the world. So suddenly people begin to know who Caleb is and just how powerful he is, and also that he's willing to voluntarily help in a situation because they didn't call him and ask him to help. After all of this has happened, Sahara tries to escape the house and ends up injuring herself, and then Caleb is about to take her outside when they're attacked by someone who has found Sahara and is planning on taking her back. Caleb ends up killing him, which distresses Sahara even more, and she asks him point blank, were you complicit in what Enrique did to all of those women, because he was torturing and killing changeling women? Were you a witness or were you a participant? his response to her is not really a response to that question. He says that he was there for every moment of it. And it's a significant point because we come back to it later on when we find out exactly how he was involved. Sahara begins to get more memories back. She realizes that she's known Caleb for a very long time. He used to visit her every year on her birthday. And every year that he would visit her on her birthday, he would give her a charm for a charm bracelet. And when she remembers this, she goes straight to his office and asks him where the rest of the charms are. And as it turns out, he has a charm for every year that she was held captive. And he gives them to her, explaining the significance of each of them, which is a really sweet scene. Caleb eventually figures out that it was Tatiana Riker-Smith who was the counselor behind holding Sahara captive, and he goes to her and find out information about why she was holding Sahara and what happened. And rather than kill her in retaliation, which is something that he would do, he goes a step further and he teleports her to this underground hidden facility, and as it turns out, it was the playroom for Enrique, and he leaves her there and he leaves her to the dark mind, which slowly sort of eats at her. It's his own form of torture, and this is where that morality chain aspect comes in, because he will do anything to keep Sahara safe, and he doesn't have an issue with killing someone. He doesn't have an issue with torturing someone if it means it will keep her safe. And at this point, she doesn't realize that, and then when she does, it's their relationship that is able to help bring him back from the brink of that. Sahara and Caleb had their first kiss, and then she asks him to go home. She wants to go and visit her father. And so he takes her, and Sahara spends some time with Leon, and then eventually Sahara and Leon go and visit Anthony, who is Faith's father and the head of the Night Star group. And Sahara talks about how she escaped and how it was Caleb who helped her. She tells a little bit of a white lie in that when asked why he would do that, because she says that he did it in order to be owed a favor from Night Star. We see the depth of affection between Leon and his daughter. Leon has done nothing but search for Sahara for 7 years, and Anthony doesn't suggest that she's going to be reconditioned, but the idea of it comes up in conversation. And he's flat out against it. He's like, no, she's not being reconditioned. We just got her back. We're going to keep her safe. And also Anthony tells Sahara to be very careful of Caleb because he's not someone that can be trusted. Obviously, after all of this, Anthony is very curious about Caleb's motives, and so he contacts him, and Caleb reveals that Tatiana was behind Sahara's captivity, and Anthony offers to go after her and to make her pay for what she did, because people forget that the Night Star group is actually very powerful. They might be foreseers, but they are a very, very powerful group of people overall. And Anthony does not stand for anyone going after his people, let alone his family. But Caleb tells him that it's handled and that Tatiana is being suitably punished. And then he asks for Anthony's backing if and when he decides to take over the net. And at this point, Anthony is not particularly willing to throw all of his support behind Caleb because he doesn't quite know what Caleb's got planned. But what he does promise is that he won't attack or oppose Caleb outright without giving him warning first. Sahara continues to stay with Leon, but one night she has a lot of trouble falling asleep, and so she calls Caleb, and he takes her rock climbing in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They have a very steamy scene where he pleasures her, and it's hilarious because he's quite clinical in the way that he does it, because everything he knows how to do, he's done from research, because technically they're both virgins. But it's a great scene, and at the end of it, he reminds her of his possessiveness of her. So you have this dichotomy of this character who has suffered a severe trauma and has someone who, in his own way, loves her, but is showing it in a very dark way. And I made a note here because the whole way through this book, Caleb has this unwavering devotion to Sahara, and a lot of it feels like, and I suppose this is the reader taking into context everything else that's going on, that Sahara was this precious thing taken from him, and he felt like Sahara was his. So it's almost like a child who has a favorite toy that was theirs that is precious to them and keeps them safe and sane and calm, and it's taken away from them and they just constantly react. And that's what it feels like with Caleb and Sahara, is he's just reacting in that way of someone who had their guiding light or their North Star taken away from them. So this whole time, Sahara is staying away from Moscow, but every time she calls, Caleb comes to see her. So she's still staying with Leon at this point. And then while she's staying with her father, they're attacked again. And this time the intruder nearly kills Leon, and Sahara fights the attacker off. He's able to get Leon to a med center in order to be treated because he's almost mortally wounded, and the decision is made that Sahara should go to a safe place. Anthony's decision is that she'll go and stay with Faith in Dark River territory because the changelings will protect her like one of their own. Caleb sort of begrudgingly agrees to this. When she gets to Dark River territory, Faith and Vaughn take her to sort of a guest house / airy where she can stay. It's all her own. Vaughn can smell Caleb on her and offers to protect her if she's concerned in any way about Caleb's attention towards her. But the funny thing is, in her own way, and maybe it's like a Stockholm syndrome kind of thing, but Caleb feels a deep sense of attachment to Caleb, and she doesn't know why. She still hasn't figured it out, aside from the fact that she knows that he came to visit her on her birthday. She doesn't know how that came about yet. He hasn't told her. So anyway, she gets to this treehouse and she loves it. It sounds absolutely delightful. And the first thing she does is ask Caleb if he wants to see it, and he teleports to her, which it's been suspected the whole time that Caleb can transport to people, not just to places, which depending on the Psy and depending on their level of teleporting ability, some of them lock on to visuals of places and can teleport there. Some of them lock on to people's faces. So we're beginning to get a hint that Caleb can sort of go wherever he wants to go, no matter what anyone else tries to do. But she invites him to the area and shows him around, and then they have another conversation around his relationship with Enrique. And again, she asks, were you a participant or were you a witness? Because she started to remember that when she knew Caleb when she was younger, that she had the impression that Enrique hurt him. And this is where we sort of get to his trauma, in that we find out that Caleb was psychically raped by Enrique. So Enrique, when he was 3 years old, Caleb was taken to a facility for very dangerous Psy children because his powers were so great. And he was there for about 4 years before Enrique took him out at 7 and basically trained him up from then. The way that Enrique controlled him was basically he wove his way into Caleb's mind and made him do whatever he wanted him to do. And quite often that involved forcing Caleb to bear witness to everything that Enrique was doing. And he couldn't stop it, he couldn't control it, and he couldn't do anything about the situation. He was just forced to watch. And then later on, Enrique also forced him to torture and murder others. Not necessarily the changeling women, but he was definitely involved in a few things that have caused him quite a bit of trauma. Caleb then takes Sahara back to Moscow and they have sex for the first time. And it's hilarious whenever we get Psy heroes because there's always something that happens in a sex scene. And in this case, Caleb causes earthquakes. Now, the Moscow house is very far removed from the city and it's surrounded by sort of empty land, but he causes earthquakes. And it's hilarious. And then there's a very funny conversation afterwards around the fact that they really can't have sex in a populated area because it would not end well. And then the next major reveal, and this is the reveal that I had forgotten, was that Enrique is technically Caleb's father. So Caleb doesn't really have any records on his parents except that they're dead, but his paternal DNA came from Enrique. And it comes up in a conversation when Sahara is talking about contraception, which she organised when she was staying with Leon and visited a med centre. And Caleb's quite happy about this because he has this thing about passing on his DNA. He's very uncomfortable with the idea of it because he considers himself something of a monster. Then we have the next attack, which takes place at a university in Denver, and Caleb and the Arrows go and assist again. When he returns, this prompts Caleb to begin to question why he doesn't suffer the same sort of burnouts like the other Psy. And we revisit this idea of amplification, which again calls back to Cartier's book because Cartier's able to amplify her telepathy, and Caleb talks about how his dual cardinal abilities amplify each other. So his telepathy can reinforce and amplify his telekinetic powers, and it basically makes him have a limitless supply of power to use. Sahara is beginning to realize that Caleb has this thing about the net and about it not working right. And she tries to get him to promise not to do anything to the net because it sustains so many lives, and he won't make that promise. At the same time, Sahara reveals that she no longer needs him to shield her. She's strong enough to shield on her own, and she's had some help from Sasha while she was staying in Dark River territory. And so she's feeling comfortable enough for him to remove his shields. He's obviously hesitant, but she asks him if he'll still have a way to stay connected to her, and he does. So that appeases both of them temporarily. So Sahara gets to visit the net again for the first time. And where previously all of the other characters have talked about seeing the Psy net as like a star field where every star is a member of the Psy race, Sahara sees it differently. She sees it very much like a silver stream, and she can sort of go in and she can pluck out these little threads from the stream. And to be honest, that image really resonated with me, and it's a bit of a hint as towards her true abilities. But while they're in the Psy net, Caleb tells her he wants to show her something, and he shows her this thing that he's created. He's basically created a reset button for the net, which would wipe out everyone except for the people that he's protecting. It would be a reset for the Psy race, and she's deeply horrified by this. And she tells him that she doesn't believe that he's the right person to be in charge of so many lives, even as she's beginning to realize that he's planning for the fall of silence for the Psy race. She later has this other memory of Caleb in childhood. And in fact, there's been quite a few memories by this point, including the first time that she met Caleb, because Enrique brought him to the Night Star complex while asking for Anthony's help with foreseeing something. And Anthony doesn't do business with kids, so he sent the kids outside and he left Sahara to entertain and keep Caleb out of trouble. And so they got to talking. And then every time Enrique would visit the facility, Sahara and Caleb would spend time together. And there's about a 6 or 7 year age gap between the two of them. And then there's this time when he visits and she's trying to do her maths homework and she doesn't like maths. And so they sit together and he offers to watch her complete some of the problems and then show her how to do them the correct way. As it turns out, that's that maths textbook that she was looking at earlier, and it was their writing and it was that memory. Sahara is then kidnapped while she's out shopping with Faith and Mercy in the city, and she's able to get free of her captor by using her powers. And as it turns out, she has the ability to rewrite memories and to make people do what she wants them to do, which is such a rare ability. It doesn't even have a designation, and it's one that is greatly feared because she could quite literally control anyone that she wanted to. And it's only because she's a good person that she doesn't do that. The one thing she notices is that when it's revealed that Caleb knows the true extent of her powers, he doesn't flinch from her touch because people believed that she needed to touch them in order to be able to gain access to their memories and to control them. And as it turns out, her powers have evolved. She no longer needs touch. But even though Caleb knows she disagrees with his plans, he's still not afraid to touch her. And that's a very rare thing for someone with her power, because it's almost like the boogeyman. She could make anyone do anything. And then we finally get the reveal that Caleb is the ghost, because of course he is. And he meets with Judd at the church, and the two of them are talking, and Judd wants information on Ming's whereabouts because he attacked Sienna at the end of Tangle of Need and the wolves want to go after him. Caleb also tells Judd that he no longer plans to kill everyone, and I like how blunt he was. Pretty much that blunt. He has no plans to kill everyone. Judd tells him that he's relieved because he didn't really want to have to try and execute his friend. Caleb has a friend, and it's Judd. The next attack is in Hong Kong, and Pure Psy set this almost uncontrollable fire, and it's basically out of control. And Caleb and the arrows and Ming and his soldiers all arrive and work together to try and contain it, which basically involves dropping Caleb right in the middle of it and getting him to try and contain it from the center. He does. So people begin to truly realize exactly how powerful this guy is. And afterwards, Caleb is furious and he sends the arrows after Pure Psy with the orders to eliminate them because he's had enough. Hot on the heels of that attack, there is one on a group of students who are attending a student summit or a student caucus in Geneva. And when Caleb gets there, he realizes that this one is probably a diversion from the true attack. And they manage to prevent, I think, another 2 attacks from happening. There's still a lot of fallout from this attack in Geneva. And so then Caleb goes into the Psy net and publicly condemns anyone connected to Pure Psy, and it becomes known outside of the Psy that Caleb has done this. And so you have humans and changelings in the Human Alliance and many of the Psy all supporting Caleb's actions in this case. So we slowly get to see how he's doing all this political maneuvering, but at this point he's really cranky, and rightly so. And as part of the relief efforts for this attack in Geneva, Sahara helps to connect Silver to the Pax because she's still staying in Dark River. And then Silver finds out that Sahara can translate many different languages, and so she brings her in as a translator into Geneva, and Vasek takes her there. And while this relief effort is still going on, Ming tries to assassinate Caleb with poison, and having had enough of Ming, he gives Ming's location to the Snowdancer wolves and leaves them to deal with it. And Sahara asks if he's going after them. He said no, because the wolves have a prior claim and he knows that they'll get the job done. The current head of Pure Psy, Vasquez, who we heard a lot about in the previous book, makes his way to San Francisco intent on causing even more chaos there, because of course they can, because he's just very hell-bent on Nikita, Anthony and the Changelings. And when Caleb figures this out, he contacts Judd for the first time as himself, not as the ghost, and they organise a meeting. And you have Lucas and Nate, Hawk and Judd, Anthony and Nikita are there, I think Max is there. Oh, Adam Garrett, who is from Windhaven, is there, and then there are also human representatives. So there's a representative from enforcement as well as the local community. And they're all discussing how they're actually going to contain this situation and work together to try and figure out what target Vasquez is going to hit. Meanwhile, Sahara has had this idea that she might be able to use her powers to sort of contain the situation, and so she's gone out to do a bit of a test in a highly populated area, and Vaughn has gone with her as her backup and protection. And they figure out that Vasquez is going to attack the Sky Rail because it's very heavily populated, and so everything moves into place and they manage to contain the attack, and in the process Vasquez ends up dying, but not before he reveals that the rest of the Pure Psy leadership group have gone underground and that they're probably going to be causing more chaos in the future. When Sahara and Caleb are back together, Sahara has finally regained the last memory, which is something that's been hinted at through the whole story, that Caleb is responsible for something terrible that happened to her before she was held in captivity with Tatiana. And as it turns out, Enrique knew how close Sahara and Caleb were, and he planned on using that against Caleb, and so he kidnapped and tortured Sahara while Caleb watched. And Caleb couldn't intervene. Enrique was controlling his mind and kept him as an observer. And Caleb has felt this immense amount of guilt that he couldn't save her and he couldn't protect her. And as it turns out, Sahara reminds him, no, you actually did help. You broke his control and you fought back, and she fought for him as well. That's what she remembers. And so they sort of reconcile this, and even though Caleb is never going to be the good guy, he's the person who tried to protect her. And that's enough for their relationship. And as it turns out, they have their own bond, a bit like the mating bond for the Changelings. It's sort of this connection between them in the Psynet. And initially they hide it. But then Caleb decides that it's time to convince the arrows that silence needs to fall. And Sahara tells him to show them the bond and to show them that he feels emotions and he has emotional ties, and to let them know that it will be okay. So he goes to see Aiden and Vasek and does just that. And that's the end of the book as we lead in to the final 3 books for the Psy-Changeling series. So that's a lot. I did want to say at the end of this point that there are 2 lines in this story that really make this book for me, because I'd forgotten this story, and it's very dark and it made me very uncomfortable to read it because the whole captor-captive element that's in it initially, until you sort of begin to realize the connection that these characters have. There are 2 lines that are spoken, and the first one is a question, and I'm pretty sure it was Sahara who said it. What would we have become if we'd been free? So if the 2 of them had been left to live their life, would any of this have happened? And then the second quote from Caleb, and this describes the morality chain aspect of the story, but is also a very good indication of his character, is he tells Sahara, without you, I'm a monster. So to his mind, he's had to do all of these things his whole life because someone else has forced him to do it, and he's become a monster. But what he needs is Sahara to guide him and to remind him that he's not just that. And I really love that aspect of the story. Okay, there's only a couple of things I had in the world building section, which was an interesting thing around Caleb's powers. So he is a telekinetic, and we've seen lots of telekinetics throughout the series. And in Tangle of Need, we found out that Vasek has such minute control over things that he can literally pull blood out of the carpet and off the walls and basically forensically clean a place. Whereas Caleb, on the other hand, can't do that. He is able to move things on a really large scale that cause earthquakes, but he finds it really difficult to pick up little things like shards of glass off the carpet. And I thought that's a really interesting way to distinguish how these powers can be the same but different. Speaking of Vasek, we find out that in this book he has been part of an experiment. He suddenly has this tech augmentation in his arm, and he was advised not to participate in this trial by Aiden, and Caleb doesn't think it's a good idea either, but he went ahead and did it, and that becomes a big part of the next book. And also related to Vasek, we were talking about how in the last video how TKVs, or natural born teleporters, can teleport from birth, and how Vasek needed someone to contain him. Yeah, turns out they GPS chip natural born teleporters from birth, which makes a lot of sense, because if your baby's going to be teleporting, you want to be able to find them. And another interesting thing on Psy abilities was this comment around the relationship that Faith and Sahara had as children, because Sahara was allowed to spend time with Faith, supervised time of course, because Faith had a speech development which was apparently very common to foreseers who have trouble developing their speech. But because Sahara was a very chatty little child and was very good with languages, she was allowed to spend time with Faith so that Faith would have a companion and also have a model for speech, which is kind of cool. Okay, and then in my fun things sections throughout this story, there are excerpts from the Psynet Beacon, which is sort of like their news bulletin. We sometimes get articles and we sometimes get letters to the editor talking about things that are happening throughout the story. So you get all of the different viewpoints, and I really liked that aspect of it. I really liked Caleb's casual use of his powers. He literally teleports food in whenever he wants it. When Sahara destroys the bedroom, he teleports in a lamp out of storage and a rug from storage, and just they magically appear in the room. And when he wants to build the fence, he just teleports in the equipment. He actually doesn't build that fence telekinetically, he physically builds it because he likes to burn off the energy that way, but he teleports in all the materials and he just does it. It's not even like, it's as easy as breathing. He just goes, yep, I want that, and he brings it in. Whereas for most telekinetics in this world, that would probably cause a bit of strain. Also, Caleb owns a hotel, because of course he does. That's where he gets his pastries from, is from the hotel. But the whole time I read that, I'm like, but won't they miss the pastries because they made them for their guests? Another really fun thing about Caleb is that he researched sex. And this is a really common reoccurring theme with the Psy heroes. They do a lot of research. And my favorite scene is in the next book, in Shield of Winter, when Judd has a conversation with another Psy. And you begin to see that they research this meticulously, and it's great. And then my other favorite thing was Caleb and Judd's friendship, because Caleb needs friends. He needs a lot of friends. And I'm glad that Judd is his friend, and that Judd considers himself Caleb's friend. That is the recap and all of my thoughts on Heart of Obsidian, which is a crazy, crazy book, but is really good, and it's really good fun. But the first half of it is very, very dark. It's much darker than any of the other ones, and I think Caleb gives all of the other heroes and some of the heroines a run for their money in dark, tortured backstories. But I think we get to know him a little bit better, and while he will never be a book boyfriend for me because he scares the crap out of me, he's definitely a character I appreciate a lot, and I have a lot of time for in this series because he's so complex. And upon rereading this book, I think I'd originally given this 4 stars, and I've bumped this up. I think I talked about it recently in a Books Beside My Bed video. I've adopted the 6th star for my all-time favorite books, because when I was reading this book, I did not want to put it down. And I suddenly had such a greater appreciation for all of the characters and everything that was going on, and the way that this book is so different to the other books in the series. So it's a 6-star read for me now. But yes, that is Heart of Obsidian. We do have our live show coming up. I will leave a link to that down below so that you can set a reminder to come and join us and talk about Kiss of Snow, Tangle of Need and Heart of Obsidian with us. I can't wait for this live show. It's going to be great. These are some of my favorite books. Feel free to talk to me about the book down in the comments. I would love to chat to you. I hope that wherever you are in the world, you are staying safe and healthy, and I will see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.